Hello, my friends. Hello, neighbors. Dr. Ken Berry here. I've got a great honor today. I'm interviewing a quadruple board certified physician who is an associate professor of medicine at two different institutions in California. And we're going to be talking about a very basic subject today, but some doctors and some people, I think, will find it quite controversial. It's weird when people find the basic foundational things of nature and health controversial, but sometimes they do. So without further ado, here's my guest, Dr. Robert Seheult. Welcome, doctor.
It's good to be with you, Dr. Berry.
Yes. Seheult, is that correct? Did I get that
Schwelt.
right?
Roger Schwelt. Yeah.
Schwelt. Got it. Sorry about that.
No
problem. Dr. Schwelt and I are Twitter buddies. We've been following each other for quite a while. And while we don't agree on everything, I don't think we agree on diet much. One thing that we do agree on is sunlight and increasingly ultraviolet light and infrared, near infrared, far infrared, and red light therapy. And I have a confession to make, Dr. Seheult. Initially, when I was looking into red light therapy a few years ago, I was wholly unimpressed. Most of them are LED lights. And I'm like, most of the research I'd read was with red light lasers, right?
Yeah.
Early on. And so I was like, this is a gimmick. This is a scam. And so I've actually revisited this for about the last 6 months and looked at it. And the key weakness in my knowledge about this was that I thought that the infrared light was terminated at the skin surface. I had no idea how deeply certain wavelengths could penetrate into the human body. And that was, in everything, there's a key weakness in your knowledge base. And once you go, oh, I did not know that, opens up an entire new world. So tell us briefly a little intro about you, and then let's talk about sunlight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a pulmonary doctor. So that's a doctor for the lungs, also critical care. So I take care of people in the intensive care unit, but I'm also involved with sleep medicine as well. I'm board certified there. So I deal with people that can't sleep or have sleep apnea or have insomnia. So because of that, I'm involved with circadian rhythm, which has a lot to do with light. So there was a bit of an interest, but what really got my interest into sunlight was taking care of COVID patients during the pandemic and afterwards. And during the pandemic, which is kind of still going on in a sense, that really struck me, because the paradox that I was faced with were that people were coming in, and we knew from studies that vitamin D could predict how well they would do. But when we gave them vitamin D, and vitamin D by itself without sunlight, it really didn't do as much as we thought it would.
And were you giving them vitamin D3 or vitamin D2, or were you trying to experiment with both?
Generally speaking, in the hospital where I was working, the form that they had there was vitamin D3. And we were giving that in all sorts of doses. The one that we had settled on was 5,000 a day, but there were some studies that were giving 50,000 units at once.
And just not a noticeable signal in how well the patients did.
Not only in my personal experience, but in many of the studies. There were some studies where there was some benefits, and it seemed to be done there when it was given in the biologically active form, calcitriol,
right.
calcifediol, and this was a Spanish study. It was not a randomized controlled trial though, but in my research, I began to realize, looking at other people's research and looking at it, that really vitamin D does have benefits. I supplement with vitamin D. There's no question it has benefits. Yeah, but I think the heavy lifting was done by other things that we find in the sun outside of the vitamin D benefits.
Now, starting about the early mid-1970s, the American Academy of Dermatology came out with some position statements, and there was a lot of research. Some of that research was done in the donated foreskins of boys who had been circumcised. And they said, oh, man, the sun is really, really bad for you. It looks like it probably increases your risk of skin cancer. I think what I try to look at is, what is the take-home message the patient got? And, because sometimes between the research and the researcher and the professor and the doctor and the patient, there's a huge difference. It's almost like the telephone game. There's a huge difference in what the patient hears versus what the doctor said or meant versus what the research shows. And so the effective message that most people got in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s until the current day in some cases was that any amount of sunlight is bad for you. You should stay out of the sun. If you must go out in the sun, you should use SPF 200 or something crazy and just completely block all the ultraviolet radiation. And I've always had a problem with that, how some of the research was performed, and then also how it was reported, and then how doctors, basically doctors are busy. They don't have time for 30 minutes to explain the nuance. And so they're like, just stay out of the sun. And so that's what patients heard. And I think that that's been detrimental to millions of people's health. What do you think about that? And what do you think about sunlight? And what are your recommendations?
Oh, I agree with you. We can take things to an extreme, of course, but in the regular everyday situation, let's take a look at what's happening in modern societies first, and then we'll take a look at and see what sunlight can do. If you look at the last 200 years in the United States, for instance, the amount of sunlight that we've been getting as a society is actually decreasing. It's not increasing.
Yep.
We used to work many hours outside. Very, very small amount of our time was actually spent inside. The types of windows that we had in our homes back then let in a lot of different types of light. That's actually not the case now. The types of indoor lighting that we had back then, although that doesn't factor in a huge deal, but just to note, I mean, we had candles, incandescent bulbs, and then in the 1950s, things started to change. We had fluorescent bulbs, we had LEDs now, and these are systematically eliminating infrared light, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
And then we just don't go outside as much as we used to. I think now the statistics show that the average American only spends about 7% of his life outside. And I can tell you, after the pandemic, that has significantly dropped off. And we have not recovered back up to those levels.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I try to look at everything through an ancestral lens. Some would say through an evolutionary lens. It seems to make common sense to me that things that human beings have been doing for a really, really long time are either not bad for us, we've adapted to it, or potentially it's good for us because we've had so many generations to adapt that we've actually started to use it as a net benefit instead of a net negative. And I think sunlight is one of those things. What do you think about? So what are your recommendations if a patient just says, well, doctor, how much sun should I get? Should I get a suntan? Should I use SPF? What are your kind of blanket recommendations for the average person without a history of skin cancer?
I think getting at least 20 to 30 minutes a day outside in the sun. If you can do it directly, great. If you're concerned about getting skin cancer or these sorts of things, we'll talk more about that. But the least harmful types of or time of the day to get outside, the least likely chance of burning is going to be early in the morning when the sun is rising, and then late in the evening when the sun is going down. Because the sun has to penetrate through a greater amount of the atmosphere, shorter wavelengths like ultraviolet light are not going to be able to penetrate as well. And therefore, the time of the day where you have the most amount of ultraviolet light is going to be when the sun is high overhead, and also, in the summertime and that sort of thing. But this goes to what you said. I too also had a misconception about what the sun could do for me and for my patients, because I had the same misunderstanding about how the sun interacts with our body. My eyes were open, and I apologize for using these puns, but they're going to be peppered all throughout this talk.
No worries.
My eyes were really open when I came across an article that was written by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder. Russell Ryder is the executive editor, actually, of Melatonin Research, which is a journal out of the University of Texas in that area. And the title of the paper was published back in 2019, right before we got hit with COVID. And the title is The Human Body, Melatonin, the Optics of the Human Body. And in that paper, Scott Zimmerman, who is a light engineer, went very systematically through and showed how specifically infrared light, this is the type of light that can penetrate very easily through the atmosphere. It can penetrate very easily through your clothes. It can penetrate very easily through your skin. It's very highly reflective off of trees and grass. So living in green spaces is going to give you quite a bit of this. But he shows systematically how this type of light can actually penetrate up to 8 centimeters. That's about 2.5 inches into your body. So if you can imagine the type of amount of tissue that we're talking about, if you were to go throughout your whole body, there's a very small amount of light that this is not going to be able to reach.
Yeah. And that's the thing. That was my eye-opening moment as well. When I don't know if it was that study or another one, that certain wavelengths of infrared lights, all of which are emitted by the sun. And I want everybody to understand right now, this is not an infomercial for a red light therapy system. Okay. I am not going to sell you. There will not be a link in the show notes, but because you can get all this infrared, and correct me if I'm wrong, doctor, you can get every bit of this infrared from the sun, which is free. So there might be select cases where somebody would need an infrared unit in their home or something, but the vast majority of us just need to go outside and play. And you brought up the green spaces, which you posted recently on Twitter about that, and that blew me away when I saw that picture, and I want to talk about that in a second. So what's your personal sun strategy? And then also reassure me I'm not crazy when I take my shirt off when I'm working on the farm for 30 minutes a day.
No, you're not crazy. My personal strategy is to get outside as much as I possibly can. As people who work in the healthcare industry, much of the time is spent indoors. This is where the healthcare industry is situated, unfortunately. I'm actually trying to work on getting it outside as much as possible, not just for me, but also my patients. I try to take my breaks outside if I can. You get about half an hour, generally speaking. I try to go outside. I'm trying to tell everybody that I can at the hospital that I'm working at. And the good news is that it's harder for me to find a picnic bench at lunch because more and more people are getting outside because they see the data. And you and I are talking about this almost like from a historical standpoint, but I'm here to tell you, and I'm very happy to tell you that there are very good studies that back up what we're about to say. And the evidence that we're about to give is actually quite overwhelming, to the point, I might add, that even dermatologists, for instance, Richard Weller, who's a prominent dermatologist at the University of Edinburgh, has published some opinion pieces in some major dermatological journals, which is saying, hey, look, folks, we need to take another look at this. We need to rethink our strategy on sunshine because the data is showing that not only is sunlight good for our bodies and our well-being, it also is implicated in longevity. So yes, there is a lot of data here that we can go through, and it really takes to task this understanding that sunlight is the only mitigator of melanoma and skin cancer. There's a lot of data that actually flies in the face of that.
Oh, I totally agree. And I love it that opinion pieces are being published in the more prominent dermatological journals, but I suspect it'll be about 5 or 10 years before the official position of the AAD actually changes. And, there's that lag in all branches of medicine where when something becomes self-evident, it takes about another 5 or 10 years before the associations say, oh, okay, you're right.
Well, I've got good news for you. There, if people want to look this up, it's you can see it on the internet. Richard Weller. It was published last year. It was in the Investigative Journal of Dermatology, and it's the title of his piece is called "Sunlight: Time for a Rethink." And in that article, he actually reports that a number of Australian dermatological societies are rewriting their recommendations even as we speak. They've already rewritten them. So the data is it's there. It's being digested. People are taking a new look at this.
Beautiful. Now, for those of you guys watching this on the replay, this was recorded live in front of our private PhD community. And if it's okay, doctor, if our members have questions, I'd love to put some questions up as we go along for you to answer, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And I would say anybody watching, if you want access to, I think Dr. Seheult he's quadruple board certified. So if you got a problem with something he says, you might want to check your premises. If you'd like access to some of the leading minds in health, medicine, and nutrition and ask them your questions directly, consider becoming a PhD tribe member. Now, we were talking about our ancestors back even just 200 years ago. They were out in the sun 8, 10, 12, 18 hours a day, depending on what they did. And a lot of people would say, yeah, they were much more modest and, they wore clothes. And a lot of people don't realize that clothes will give you a SPF factor. There's a different way to measure it, but we can talk about it. Most people understand SPF. Like a light cotton weave gives you a SPF of 5 to 10. If it's a thicker weave, maybe 15 to 20. But the sun is still getting through that fabric, and especially the infrared.
Absolutely. You can prove this to yourself. Just go out on a sunny day, close your eyes, and just try to feel the sun. You can tell which side of your body the sun is shining on. This was actually codified in a study that was done actually by the Department of Defense, where they wanted to see whether or not the use of infrared photography could see through clothes well enough to detect weapons being taken onto planes, etc. And they looked at several different types of materials. And it's interesting because the graph that they had in that study went up to 13 different layers of clothing. It took that many layers of clothing for them to not be able to see through the clothes, because infrared is so good at seeing through clothes. If you're walking around with 1 or 2 or even 3 layers of clothing, rest assured that infrared light from the sun is still going to be able to penetrate. Now, I want to make sure people understand this. Infrared light is a low energy light. It's not going to be causing the breaking of chemical bonds. This is not the type of light that's responsible for making vitamin D. This is not the type of light that's going to cause mutations in cancer. Okay. These can vibrate bonds. If you maybe remember from chemistry class, there was an infrared spectroscopy that you could get on compounds, and it would tell you if there's OH wiggling and CH wiggling. So this is not breaking bonds, as opposed to ultraviolet radiation, which is extremely high powered, breaks double bonds, can convert cholesterol derivatives into vitamin D derivatives. Yes, that is very powerful, ultraviolet light. But the ironic thing about ultraviolet light is it's not very good at penetrating. Think about it like this. When you pull up to a stop sign and a car pulls up next to you and it's playing really loud music, inside that car that's listening to the loud music, they're hearing all of the frequencies of sound, the high pitch, the low pitch, and everything in between. But what are you getting? You're only getting that frequency that's able to penetrate through his car, go through your car, and shake your steering wheel. And you know what that is. It's very low pitched sound. That's because low frequencies like infrared light are able to penetrate very, very deeply through materials.
I love it. Now, we've got a question here from one of our coaches. What about when it's cloudy all day? Can we still get what we need? And then let's also wrap in, what about in winter? Is it worth braving the cold to get out in the sun?
Excellent questions. Let's tackle the first question, which is about, what was that first question again?
On a cloudy day, are we going to get anything from going outside?
Here's the problem. Clouds are made up of water. And as it turns out, we'll talk about how this infrared light actually works when we talk about the mitochondria. It's the water and those kinds of bonds that absorb the infrared light. So yes, clouds will significantly diminish the amount of infrared light that you can get outside on a cloudy day. However, it's still orders of magnitude more infrared light outside than you would get if you were inside. So I would say don't allow the clouds to prevent you from going outside. Although it does diminish it, it's still better than staying inside. Now, the second question is about wintertime. And as we all know, in the wintertime, the sun doesn't come up as high. And that's a problem for ultraviolet radiation, as we talked about. And therefore, that's a problem for creating vitamin D. And it's the reason why I supplement with vitamin D, especially in the wintertime. However, it's not a problem for infrared light. And I proved this to myself one day. I remember in the wintertime, I live in Southern California, but I live up about a mile up, so we get snow. And I was able to witness this, and it rings true just about anywhere you are. We had snow on the roof, and there was quite a bit of it. And I could see that as the sun was going down in the evening, the temperature was around freezing. It was still to the point where you would not expect to have melting. But as the sun was hitting on the roof and it was directly on the snow was actually melting quite rapidly. Yep. As soon as the sun went down, the temperature did not change, but the dripping immediately stopped. And this should tell you something. It's the infrared radiative heat coming from the sun that is melting the snow. And that should tell you something else. And that is that even in the deep darkest of winter, when the sun comes up only a little bit and is back down again before 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, getting outside and getting that infrared light is really important for 2 reasons. Number one, it's available. Yep. And number 2, it's actually the time of year where you need that infrared light the most. And the reason is because the days are short. Dr. Barry, this is something that will blow your mind if you haven't seen it already. It blew my mind and the consequences of it. But I looked at a graph, and I would highly encourage any one of you to look at this graph that can be made based on this. And that is looking at the seasons of the year, looking at the day of the year, and looking at the death certificates from that date for heart disease, influenza, pneumonia, kidney disease, dementia, cancer, other inflammatory diseases, you name it, just about all of the major causes of death. And you will see something that is astounding. You will see that every single one of those diseases, whether they are infectious diseases or non-infectious diseases, they all rise at the same time, and they all peak about 1 to 3 weeks after the shortest day of the year. This is the reason why, by the way, we have a flu season. They all come back down again after the days start to lengthen, and they all go to a nadir, or their lowest amount, about 1 to 3 weeks after the shortest day of the year. Many people have said, well, this is because it gets cold and people go inside and the viruses get spread around and we have holidays. This is the reason why this happens. Well, I would encourage you again to look at that list, because there are non-infectious diseases that also go up that would have nothing to do with an infectious disease. And the other thing I would mention is, if you look in Australia, again, the shortest day of the year there is not going to be in December. It's going to be in June. And what do we see? We see, again, all of the same diseases going up in June and July, and coming back down and being at the lowest in the wintertime. And guess what? They still celebrate Christmas in December in Australia.
Exactly. So they're having all of the sugary treats and junk and alcohol at Christmas time, but their peak of death from chronic diseases is in their winter. It's not at Christmas time. I love that, because that kind of shoots that in the head. I know you were recently on Huberman, and he loves to talk about get out in the morning sunlight, and I agree with him on that. Do you think that as far as our circadian rhythms are, do you think getting in that morning sunlight on your face, not looking directly at the sun, but letting it get in your eyes, how important is that, do you believe?
It's extremely important. And this goes to the whole question about our debate that we're having right now in the United States about, should we be on daylight savings time or should we be on standard time?
Yes.
Let me tell you something that sealed the deal for me. First of all, let me just tell you that the academy that I belong to, which is the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, has already put out a position paper clearly stating that they are in favor of a standard time for the whole year. So eliminating daylight savings.
And I saw that, and I'm like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, because I've seen a lot of people who should know better being in favor of daylight savings time. And I'm like, wait a minute, why? And I'm so glad to hear that they came out with that official position, because I think daylight or standard time, that's what we should be on. And I think that it has provable, documented health repercussions.
Well, and that's exactly why the Academy recommends it, because the studies show this. I'll even go a step further. So yes, it's quite obvious to me, for our health, for the circadian rhythm, that getting outside and getting light into our eyes is beneficial. What's mind-blowing about this, what I'm about to tell you, is that it even goes beyond that. Many people who are against standard time, okay, so they're for daylight savings, one of the reasons they bring up is that they hate the idea of the sun rising at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning, depending on where they live. Some people, it's not that early, but depending on where you live, it could be that early, especially in the summertime. What we found in science is this. There's a study that was done, I believe it was like 96 subjects in a randomized controlled trial, where they had these people in bed, okay? They were still sleeping. And what they did was they simply simulated a dawn experience in their room where they raised the ambient light while they were still sleeping, okay? And what they found was that these people slept better, had a better quality of life, and they actually improved their scores on cognitive tests. That means their ability to produce cognitive thinking on a test. So this is known as the dawn simulator. You can actually buy lamps to put in your room that actually simulate this effect. But imagine if we did this, if we had it naturally, if you had blinds that allowed some of that light to come in, you're asleep, you don't even know it, but that light is coming into the room. It's actually, while you're asleep, it's going through your eyelid, hitting the back of your retina, stimulating the retinal ganglion cells, and it's already starting to do its magic on the circadian rhythm.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Now, let's turn. Oh, yes, the green spaces. I really wanted to talk about that because you posted about on this about on Twitter about this recently, that when you are in the presence of lots of trees and lots of grass and lots of green leafy vegetation, the infrared is not just coming from the sun. You're getting so much extra infrared, and I think there's actually research about people being out in green spaces. And I for a while I was like, I don't know if it's the blue of the sky or the green of the trees, or is it both? It's hard to tease that out. But tell us what was found when they turned the cameras on the plants.
Absolutely. So, and you can do this yourself. Just go onto Google, type in infrared photography, hit images, and see the types of pictures that come back. And what you'll see is that anything that has leaves, grass, green, anything like that is going to be highly reflective of infrared light. So these leaves are really quite amazing. They specifically absorb in the green, in the blue and the reds that are visible, and create and do photosynthesis to create fuel for us to eat, okay? But then at the same time, they also reflect back to us infrared light, which is actually beneficial. Now, we haven't talked about specifically how it's beneficial. I'll just say this briefly. Each one of our cells, except for our red blood cells, have mitochondria. And there is something called the mitochondrial theory of aging, which states basically that as you age about 40 years, there's a 70% drop in ATP production, which is exactly what the mitochondria is there for. Every single process in your body runs off of ATP. And you can imagine how you would look and feel if you didn't have that energy. Basically, you're like the Energizer Bunny without batteries, okay? So you can imagine that, how sad that would be. This is exactly what's at the core of many of the diseases that we see in the United States. Diabetes, dementia, obesity, at the core of all of these diseases, the main ones that we see, heart disease, are bad mitochondria. So what they're finding now, and what Russell Ryder's paper and Scott Zimmerman's paper delve into and show the evidence for and cite, is that infrared light can penetrate deeply into the body, can be absorbed by photoreceptors in the mitochondria, which upregulate production of ATP and produce a substance, or increases the production of a substance called melatonin. Now, this is the same melatonin that is produced in your pineal gland for sleep, but this is orders of magnitude higher amounts in the cell, right at the level of the mitochondria. And the purpose of this melatonin is to reduce the key killer of mitochondria over time, and that's something called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress leads to inflammation. It leads to all sorts of diseases. So that's important to understand. So what we're saying again here is that infrared light allows your mitochondria to work at a higher level. They've actually demonstrated this in randomized controlled trials out of University College London, Glenn Jeffrey's lab. And this basically turns the clock back on your aging, okay? Because you're able to produce more energy, have less oxidative stress, have less chances of diabetes and things of that nature. So for many years, we have seen data that shows that people who live in green spaces have less diabetes, have all-cause mortality that is reduced, have reduced hypertension. All sorts of health outcomes are better for people who live in green spaces. And for many years, the scientists said, well, we don't really know what's doing it. Maybe people who live in green spaces have more money and they can get better health care. Maybe they're exercising more. Maybe they're doing all of these things. And so it was kind of poo-pooed in a way that this was all the result of confounders in the studies. Well, an amazing study was just published last year, and it was really exciting. What they did was they went to a 4 square mile area in South Louisville, Kentucky. And they went around to everybody in that area, in that 4 square mile area, and they measured something called CRP levels, or highly sensitive CRP. This is a molecule that is increased in disease. We see higher levels in people who have strokes. We see higher levels in people who have heart disease, all sorts of things. And they measured it. So they just documented what it was. And then they did something unthinkable. They went around and they actually purchased 8,000 mature trees with leaves on them. And they went around and they planted those trees in that 4 square mile area. This is mind-boggling. That's like 2,000 trees in 1 square mile. That's going to have a tremendous effect on that population. They did not put them on any kind of guaranteed income. They did not do an exercise program. They did not change a single variable in that 2-year period while they were planting these trees, except plant the trees. And then they went around and they measured everybody's HSCRP levels. There was a drop of 13 to 30% of highly sensitive CRP levels in those patients, in those subjects. That equates to about what we see when we put people on a 3 times a week moderate exercise program. And all we did was literally, in my opinion, put infrared light reflectors everywhere they could, so that when in the rare incidents where they did go outside, they were getting more infrared light at that time.
While you were telling the story, I was trying to imagine the conversation as the researcher tried to convince the department head to let him buy 8,000 trees. He's like, "You want to do what?" But I love that. That's so awesome. So not only go out in the sun, but get around plants. Go be in the yard, be in the forest, be in the pasture. Now
it's kind of like it's a twofer or a threefer. Look, that study kind of demonstrated that there actually is something specifically with the trees themselves that's doing something. But you and I both know if we're going to go outside to be with the trees, we're more likely to exercise. We're more likely to get fresh air. Hey, look, there's even something called forest bathing, which is based on the scientific fact that these trees give off chemicals in a good sense that actually improve our immune system. They've done a lot of studies on the Hinoki cypress forests of Japan. It's not just limited to those trees. All these trees that are aromatic give off these types of compounds. And so you're getting a lot of benefit just by doing one thing.
And so with the infrared light's effect on the mitochondria, your advice to somebody with severe fatigue, regardless really of cause, even though that's probably the subpopulation that has the least amount of energy that would say, "Hey, I want to go outside," they're probably the least likely to say that. They need to drag themselves outside into the sun in a green space. That's going to help with the chronic severe fatigue.
It's certainly not going to hurt, and the data seems to indicate that it's going to help. So one of your guests asked the question about clouds, and yes, it does reduce the amount of incidence of infrared light, and that reminded me of a study that was done. This was at Oxford. It was a Oxford University study where they looked at 10,000 subjects, had them draw blood, and checked for insulin sensitivity and triglycerides. And what they found was this: if they looked at the amount of sunlight in the weather report in the previous 7 days before the blood was drawn, they could actually predict with accuracy, based on the hour of sunlight, what the insulin sensitivity would be and the triglycerides would be. Basically, the more hours of sunlight in the previous 7 days before the blood draw, the better the insulin sensitivity and the lower the triglycerides in that patient.
Fascinating. And so we keep touching on how sunlight, infrared, green spaces improve or affect your health. So let's turn and talk about hospitalized patients, because my guest today is quadruple board certified. If you're going to be in the intensive care unit, this is the guy you want to see walking in the room to be in charge of your healthcare. What have you found, and what does the research show about infrared light in the hospital? About what if there's a window in your hospital room? What if there's not a window? What if you're in the bed that's not beside the window, if you share a room? Is there a place for sunlight in the care of hospitalized patients?
Absolutely. I've become convinced of this. And if you follow the thinking that I've been going through for the last 3 years and where it's evolved to today, I mean, this is one of the things that deeply concerned me, was the fact that there was such a stark difference in people who came in with good vitamin D levels versus people that came in with very low vitamin D levels. And the difference between them was stark. We saw it not only at the level of the hospital, but also in studies that were published many times over. And yet we didn't see that benefit. So I started looking into this whole idea, specifically in SARS-CoV-2. Turns out that the ACE2 receptor is not just there to accept the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's actually a modulator of oxidative stress. And again, it feeds right into this idea that the mitochondria and its health are very important. See, what happens is if you have diabetes or if you're overweight, just the very same people that we saw coming into the hospital that were having issues with COVID, your cooling system in the engine, your antioxidative stress system is right on the edge. Think about a car that is just running a little bit hot. And then what happens is the virus comes in, it cripples this oxidative stress balance. And now instead of your engine running just a little bit hot, it's now overheating, it's shutting down, and now you've got some big problems. So my goal was to see whether or not we could change the oxidative stress situation in these patients that were coming into the hospital. And so we would give them melatonin and all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, what we realized that is what these patients really needed was sunlight. There's a number of studies that have been shown in the United States, in Italy, in the UK, that have shown that people who have more sunlight, populations that had more sunlight were less likely to die of COVID-19. I actually teamed up with a geographist from Mexico. We published a study looking at the whole world and looking at every country that had a population that had more than 50% overweight. And there was a correlation between latitude and mortality. Finally, though, that's a correlation. What you really need is a randomized controlled trial to really show the evidence. And finally, when I saw this, I was absolutely convinced. So this was a study that was done in Brazil, and this was involving COVID patients that were admitted to the hospital for pneumonia. And they were not so sick that they had to be on a ventilator in the ICU, but they were sick enough that they needed to be admitted. And so what they did was they actually made a jacket that they could wear and they could put on the patient. And on the inside of this jacket was thousands of LED lights that gave off light at 940 nanometers, which is right in the middle of the near infrared spectrum. You cannot see that type of light. It was not very, very powerful. If I were to give you kind of a relationship here, the power from the sun is about 150 to about 100 milliwatts per square centimeter. This was around down to 2.9. So a fraction of the amount of power. So what they did was they put this jacket on all 30 patients that were enrolled in the study, just 30 patients. And randomized, blinded, they turned on the jacket in certain cases. And they did this on the same patients for 15 minutes a day. And they did it for a full 7 days. The results were astounding. I couldn't believe it. First of all, the oxygen saturation improved much more quickly in those that had the jacket turned on. Their ability to take a breath in, their heart rates, their respiratory rates, even their white blood cell counts that were involved with fighting the infection, all of them improved in the right direction on those that had the light turned on. But the most astounding statistic and endpoint in the study was that those that had the light turned on were discharged from the hospital a full 4 days. So those that had it on were discharged after 8 days. Those that did not have it on, 12 days. And if you look at that, that's 4 days that you're not in the hospital. Can you imagine the amount of money that would be saved? I mean, we spend thousands of dollars on patients for one hospital day because of everything that goes into their hospital care. We could have discharged patients much more quickly. This was infrared light at 940 nanometers in one wavelength. Imagine what could happen if we got the patients outside into the sun where all of the wavelengths are there and it's just in the right combination. So this planted the seed in my head that I would treat future patients that I would have with getting them out into the sun.
And I love that that's where your mind went with this, because the average researcher or doctor would be like, we need to get a patent on this infrared vest, and then we'll put that on every ICU patient, right? But you're like, yeah, let's go back to foundational principles on this. Yeah. Let's get these people out in the sun. And so there's actually some research that differentiates between if you share a hospital bed, the person nearest the window versus the person farthest from the window. I think that's also quite telling. Would you like to share?
Yeah. So not only that, yeah, absolutely. There is data that shows that in a 2-bed room, the bed closer to the window is discharged faster. But hey, look, if you're a hospital administrator, you know that the amount of federal funding that you get and the reimbursement is based on survey data. So you ask your patients, how was your stay? There's actually data that shows that if you are in a room with a bigger window, if you're in a room with a bigger view, if you're in a room with more light that's coming in, and they've broken this down in these studies, in every one of those situations that I'm talking about, the patient is happier and they're more likely to give you a higher score on your surveys. So this is really a win-win. And I'll tell you, in terms of the financial incentives, many hospitals are in a situation where they are paid based on the number of patients that they have to take care of. So they have a population that they have to take care of. And they're already given that income. That's their revenue. And then it's out of their pockets that they have to pay when the patient actually has to be hospitalized. So if they were to adopt this idea of getting patients into the sun, it's a win-win-win. The patients are happier. The hospitals have to pay out less because they get out of the hospital faster. And the patients get better, and there's more beds to fill in for other patients that need to use them. So there's really no downside to adopting this idea of incorporating sunlight into inpatient care.
No, I totally agree. And we actually see photographic evidence of this from 100 years ago, even 80 years ago, back when doctors didn't necessarily feel like that a pharmaceutical was the answer to every medical question. There would be the entire rooftops of hospitals dedicated to, let's put the patients out in the sun for a certain amount of day. Many recommendations, especially for tuberculosis in the past, was you need to move to Arizona, or you need to move somewhere and just literally stay in the sunlight. That will help you. And I don't know if that cures tuberculosis, but I'm sure it strengthens your mitochondria and your other immune defenses to the point where at least you've got a fighting chance.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when I look back at some of these giants in medicine, like William Osler, these guys that practiced, they were able to put a stethoscope on the chest, and they were able to tell, based on the heart sounds, what the severity was of the mitral valve stenosis. Today we have echocardiography, which kind of tells us everything that we need to know. And so our senses, our observational skills have been kind of deadened because of all this technology. These guys back then, they didn't have all of the scientific accoutrements that we're blessed with today. So when I see them talking about what their observations are, I pay keen attention to that. Someone that was at the bedside taking care of patients day in, day out was a lady by the name of Florence Nightingale.
Yes.
If you don't know who she is, she was the founder of modern nursing. She was born into a very rich family that she didn't need to do nursing. That was her calling. She decided to help out with the British Army. She went down to Crimea during the Crimean War, and she took care of British soldiers, and she really cleaned that place up. So she's seen a lot, and even she said this. She quoted this, and I quote her from this from 1850. She says, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically, she's like, the one thing that I've seen that works for the whole disease in terms of the number one thing that gets patients better faster more than anything else is fresh air. But then she said, second, a very close second to that is sunlight. Not just light, but direct sunlight seems to do a whole good of work in terms of these patients.
I love that. Chris B says when he was a patient at the Shriners Hospital back in the 90s, they would roll them out, bed and all, into the sunshine every day. Now, I have to confess, I've been practicing family medicine for 22 years, and I worked in the ICU. I worked in the ER. I have never heard a doctor any age, even the old graybeards, I have never heard a single doctor that I practice with or around recommend sunlight like this. But here's Chris at the Shriners back in the 90s. They put them out in the sun every day.
Yeah. And I started to talk about this more and more and really show the evidence for it. And I was really excited. I actually used it in one of my patients. When I was on the ICU service, they asked me to go see a patient that was nearly ready to be intubated from COVID. And it was really rare because this was about a year or two after the lot of the waves. I hadn't really seen it much. I was actually kind of a little depressed at the fact that I had found out this thing and I really didn't get to use it on a lot of the patients because I didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah.
But there was one patient that did come in, and I people kind of knew me at the hospital for me telling them this. And so I got excited. They got excited. And I'll make a long story short, our respiratory therapist got together a couple of tanks of oxygen where this guy could, subsist on that amount of oxygen, because he was on 35 liters, 100%. That's really hard to reproduce portably. But we were able to do it, and we got him to a wheelchair, and we wheeled this guy outside. And I told him, look, 30 minutes every day, we need to do it. And sure enough, this guy was discharged. He went from almost needing to be intubated to about 4 or 5 days later, stepwise coming off the oxygen, to basically being discharged home without oxygen.
Nice. I was just imagining in my head the nurses reading your order when they first read it, and they're like, "Oh my God, what?" Right? But I guess then when they saw the results on the patient, that may have changed their mind a little bit. Let's talk about let's talk more about the infrared, the benefits of that. And like I said earlier, I was very skeptical because I did not know the key fact that it penetrates so deeply in the body. Remind us again how deeply certain wavelengths can penetrate. And then is there a place for infrared light unit therapy in specific situations?
I totally agree that there is. If you look at the literature and the way that you measure light penetration, some will measure it as a direct line to see whether or not it can penetrate. And in those types of experiments, it may be a few millimeters to a centimeter. But realize that that's not actually how that type of light behaves. What happens is that light will go in and it will scatter and it will bounce a number of times and before it gets picked up. If that's how you're measuring it, you can go up to about 8 centimeters. You probably remember this just as well as I do. In medical school, one of the examinations that we were taught to assess for sinusitis was to go into a dark room and to get a pen light or powerful light and to place it right over the maxillary sinus and then have the patient open their mouth. And if you could look into the roof of their mouth and see it glowing, it meant that the maxillary sinus was empty and it didn't have any pus in it. You remember that? I
do, from my Bates manual of physical examination. Yeah, it's a great test.
And so realize what's going on there. We're not even talking about infrared light. That's visible light, which even can penetrate less than infrared. And it's penetrating through the soft tissue, the skin, the bone, the muscle, going through the mucosa and that space in the maxillary sinus, and then doing it all again on the other side, and then popping out in the back. Obviously, you're not seeing a delineated light. It's just sort of a glow, right? And that's because the light is bouncing around and it's diffusing. When you measure it that way, this light can go right through. In fact, Bob Fosbury, who is an astrophysicist at the University College of London and is very big into this. He actually has a couple of talks on the internet. If you look up Bob Fosbury about light and astrophysics, he'll explain this. He sent me a photograph of his hand with infrared light going through it, and you don't see bones, you don't see anything. This stuff just penetrates right through. And of course, my hand, I'm sure his hand is at least a couple of centimeters.
Yeah, and I've actually seen that picture. I think you posted it on Twitter. And the only thing that is visible is the larger blood vessels, because the water in the blood absorbs enough of the infrared that you actually see. It's almost like a venogram. Yep. But you cannot see the bones at all. The infrared light goes completely through the bones like they're not even there.
Right. And I may add that you may have seen this in the hospital. They have a device that nurses use now to see if they can find veins in the skin. Yep. It's exactly the same thing. They use infrared light, it reflects it, and then it projects that image onto the skin to show where those veins are to help the nurses find them.
Yep. Now let's talk about some potential drawbacks or negative effects of blue light, which is in the sunlight. But I'm talking more about inside of our houses, the LEDs, the incandescent versus fluorescent. How big of a deal is blue light exposure? Is there a time of day when it's okay, but then in other times of day you should try to avoid it? Do those silly orange blue blocker glasses actually do anything beneficial? Let's talk about blue light in our houses and in our workplaces.
Excellent. So the first thing that I want to make sure that we understand before we go down that talk is the fallacy. Sometimes we think of this is the fallacy of reductionism. And what do I mean by that? Is that in science, this is what we always do. If something is beneficial or detrimental, we will tear it apart until we find the thing that we think is doing that deed. And then we'll ascribe all of it to that thing. And then therefore, if that thing is in anything else, then that thing that it's in must also have the same problem.
Yes, very common.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been proven as a problem in terms of logic many, many times. We had patients that were on diets with lung cancer high in vitamin E, vitamin A, beta carotene, and we found that those patients that had diets high in those supplements did better. And so what we did was we took it out, we concentrated it, and we gave them high doses of that. And what happened? They actually did worse.
Yep.
So it's this reductionism, and it's the same thing that we see with ultraviolet light, right? So those studies that show that ultraviolet light is detrimental for the skin and it causes skin cancer, that was ultraviolet light that was there without the benefit of infrared light and all of the other components of the sunlight. So yes, every sort of light is in sunlight, right? So ultraviolet is there, blue light is there, infrared light is there. But I believe there's something that we probably haven't been able to put our finger on or don't completely understand, that ultraviolet light in the spectrum of sunlight is not as detrimental as it might be if it were isolated. And your question brings up a very good point. When we go inside and we're under these artificial lights, we are getting this light for the very first time in the existence of human nature that is not also combined with the other aspects of light. Let me fully explain here. If you were to look at the solar spectrum, it's going to go from ultraviolet on one end to infrared on the other, and it's all going to be combined. You're getting this all at the same time. Why is this important? This is important because the tissue in your eye is actually the highest concentration of mitochondria. There's a lot of work that is being done in your retina for you to be able to see objects in color in real time. There's a lot of data, and therefore that requires a lot of energy. And the type of light that nourishes those mitochondria is that infrared light that we're talking about. So the thing that taxes the mitochondria is blue light and visible light, because it has to work those through, it has to process those. But the things that nourish your mitochondria is that infrared light that is out of our visible spectrum. So imagine now you're going inside, and because there's so much energy that's, quote, wasted producing light that you cannot see, we have now, through science and technology, created a bulb that only produces light in the visible spectrum and gives off absolutely no light in the infrared spectrum. So what's going to happen? People have visual fatigue. And so what you're doing is you're taxing the mitochondria in your retina to keep producing signals, but you're not allowing it to reduce the oxidative stress through infrared light that will allow it to regenerate and produce ATP at those levels. There was a study that was done out of, again, University College London, Glenn Jeffrey's lab, where he took older patients who are susceptible to this theory of aging where their ATP goes down. And sure enough, they had difficulty when they assessed them distinguishing colors. This was at their baseline, okay? And this was especially, he's noticing, he's doing the study as we speak, and he hasn't come out with the results yet of the study with LEDs, but let's just say he took people in everyday life who had this problem with distinguishing colors. Then what he did was something very interesting. He took 670 nanometer lights and projected it into their eyes for just 2 to 3 minutes. And it only worked in the morning time, what I'm about to tell you. And what he was able to see was a 27 to 30% improvement in their ability to distinguish colors. And his theory is that this red light, this infrared light, that area is improving the output of ATP. It's improving the ability for those mitochondria to give ATP so that the neurons, which use that ATP, can then give better signals so our brain can distinguish colors better.
Fascinating, fascinating. So what about blue blocker glasses? What about putting a blue blocker on your screen? What about switching out your LEDs or your fluorescents for incandescent? And then who is this? Fantastic said, what about the light from fireplaces, from candles? Is that better than artificial lights? Obviously not as efficient, but is it healthier?
So incandescent light from hydrocarbons, like fire, they put wood on the fire, you see that. Candle light, these are all going to be full biological spectrum type of light. They're not going to be just the type of blue light. By the way, there's other issues with LED lights. They flicker. And yes, we know that incandescent bulbs also flicker, but there's sort of an inertia with that because it's still hot and it still glows. So the flicker is not as bad as it is with LED bulbs. But your question about getting rid of blue blockers, that kind of the answer to that question shifts away from the red light mitochondrial ATP efficiency question, and then goes back to this whole idea about circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm can be disrupted by light coming into the eye, okay? Especially light at night. And these receptors that pick up this light are particularly tuned to 480 nanometers, which is blue light. So what some people believe may be beneficial is that if you were to block that particular light that these receptors are attuned to, you might somehow be able to mitigate the effects of light causing a shutdown of melatonin and good night's sleep and all that. Theoretically, that's the case, but in all reality, any kind of light is going to shut down and disrupt the circadian rhythm. So I would say this, that the best thing to do is to have no light, okay? The second best thing would be to block the blue light, because that's the most effective way of shutting it down. And then, of course, the worst thing is to just not wear any blue blockers and have the lights on at night.
Gotcha. Excellent. So is there a situation where a red light therapy system that you would buy on Amazon, is there ever a situation where you would recommend something like that? And if so, what specific wavelengths, if any? Or do you think that's just a waste of money? Go out and play in the sun.
I think if you can get out into the sun, you're going to get it's much cheaper. There's no supply chain necessary, and you're going to get the best results possible. So I would say if you're able to get out into the sun, that's what you should be doing. Now, that being said, you and I both know, having worked in the intensive care unit, there's some patients that you just cannot move. They're not even stable enough to go down for a CT scanner.
Yes.
That's not a lot of people, but it is some people.
Yes.
And I could see, for instance, how a medical supply company and with the right research could come up with a device that could be beneficial for those types of patients. Here's the problem, though. Glenn Jeffrey's lab used 670 nanometers. There's a company called Neuronic, which makes a helmet and uses lasers that are able to penetrate through to help with some neurological diseases, which they're not FDA approved for, but they're FDA cleared for, because they believe it might work in things like Parkinson's and dementia. And they may have some actual data on that. They use 1070. Okay. The Brazilian data that I was talking about with the COVID, where they admitted to the hospital, that's 940. So here's the issue. We have some sense about what wavelengths might be beneficial, but have we tested every single wavelength? No. Have we tested every single level? We haven't. There's another degree of freedom that we haven't mentioned, and that's how powerful should the light be, and for how long should it be? And it brings in a whole discussion of something called the biphasic nature of photobiomodulation, which is that at the beginning, the more light that you give, the more benefit you get. And then after a certain point, there's really no more benefit. There may even be detriment. I can tell you, for instance, in talking to Glenn Jeffrey, he's been studying the mitochondria now for decades. And he's told me this on several occasions. Whether the mitochondria is in a Drosophila fly, if it's in a bee or in a human, after about 15 to 20 minutes of stimulation, you're going to get the sort of the maximal benefit after that period of time. So, going into a sauna, a red light sauna, infrared light sauna, where you crank up the amount of energy, there may be a period of time where it may be too much. It may be not the right wavelength. We just don't know because we haven't done those studies. So when it came time for me to buy a sauna, I had to ask myself this question. Should I buy a regular Finnish sauna, dry sauna, or water that you can pour water on? Or should I get an infrared sauna? I chose to do the Finnish sauna because that one has the most amount of data. Not to say that the infrared sauna is not useful. It very well may be. I'm just more inclined to get out into the sun and try to get that type of benefit.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you've mentioned several times in this chat how quickly in some of these areas we bump up against the edge of research. Like we need more research here. I love reading old research from the teens and 20s and 30s, and you notice a distinct shift in basic physiological research in humans in the 1940s and 50s, when pharmaceuticals came on the scene and quickly just consumed the entire practice of medicine. And I believe that we gave up on that kind of basic foundational research way before we should have.
Yeah.
I believe, and you can tell me if this is silly or if you believe this as well, I believe that there are benefits from being in the sun that we don't even know about, that we have not discovered yet. I think there are many. I think there's a long list because everybody knows vitamin D. And now many more people are aware of the mitochondrial effect from infrared. But I opine that there are many other benefits that we just don't know about yet because almost magically, everybody became uninterested in researching things like the sun when you could research this drug and make $1 million. What do you think?
100% agree. There's so many chronic diseases, I believe, that would improve if we would just get people out into the sun. Let me tell you a story. It's a true story. And I wish I had the actual films to show you, but it was sent to me. There was a mother in Minnesota that had a son who came down with lymphocytic leukemia. And he was placed on chemotherapy, 15 years old. And unfortunately, he developed a fungal eating pneumonia as a result of the immunosuppression. He was hospitalized at a major medical center in Minnesota in the middle of June. And he progressed, unfortunately, to the point where they had to remove his left lung. It was Mucor. It had completely consumed. There was a cavity. And they were giving high doses of amphotericin B and posaconazole. These are very powerful antifungals.
Yes.
And unfortunately, 15 years old, had to be moved over to the adult side because they had to remove his lung. They did a surgery to remove his entire left lung. And shortly after that, he went back to the floor. And about 2 weeks later, he started to decline because the fungus had moved to the right lung. And over the next week or so, despite all of their efforts, everything that they could do, and you know, 15-year-old boy, major tertiary medical center, staff dedicated to doing what they do. They were pulling the kitchen sink and throwing that in, everything they could possibly do. Finally, it got to the point where his oxygen requirements were increasing. He was now placed on BiPAP. He was not doing well, and the team had a family meeting. And it was at that time that they unfortunately had to tell the family that there was really nothing else that they could do, that he was looking toward intubation, but they did not recommend intubation because that would be a bridge to nowhere. They recommended, IV fluids and IV medicines and just trying to keep him comfortable. And then they had to engage the patient himself because he's awake and alert enough to know what's going on, and had to tell him that he basically had 2 days to live. At the pace that he was going, he had 2 days to live. And as the mom is telling me this, she's just breaking down because she can remember it in her mind like it was yesterday. They asked that boy, what's the last thing that you want to do? I mean, what's your request? What can we do for you? And if you've worked, Dr. Barry, in the medical world, when you've got somebody that you're trying to do everything for and it's not working, and they have a last request, you know that your nurses will tread high water, high tide to do anything that they want, that they can do, just so they can give them their last request.
Yes.
And his last request was, believe it or not, I just want to go outside. And so they packed up this guy in his bed with all of this equipment, the BiPAP machine, the oxygen. They did a more heroic thing than I did for my patient. I was just able to get this guy into a wheelchair. They packed the whole bed up and they moved this guy outside. So there was a CT scan that was done before they did this, and that was the CT scan that was the basis of the whole conversation about being DNR. It showed basically complete absence of the left lung, of course, and a huge infiltration of white infiltrative changes all throughout the right remaining lung. So he went outside the first day. He had a white count in the 20s. He had a fever, all of the signs of just a rapidly progressive Mucor diagnosis. By the way, the family had also had this device called a Firefly device, which I'm not too familiar with, and they used it for about 5 minutes a day. It's basically a device that shines ultraviolet and infrared light all sort of together. They had been using this up to this point as well, on and off. But now that things were getting worse, they thought they got nothing to lose. They were also doing this. So I have to be honest, I don't know how much of it was the sunlight getting outside and how much of it was this device, because both things happened at the same time. But after the first day, the fever went away, his white count came down, and he felt a little better. Went out the second day. This is the day that he was supposed to die. White count came down even more. By the third day, everything had normalized. The fever was gone. The oxygen requirement was getting better. By the fifth day, he was back on nasal cannula. The doctors were really scratching their heads at this point. And they said, hey, if he's getting better, maybe we could have him, finish his chemo and he could actually kick this cancer. Let's get a CT scan. So they took him downstairs. He went into the CT scanner and they all met in the room and they pulled it up. And the mom said, I can remember distinctly, as soon as they pulled it up, there was just a gasp in the room. And there was even one or two of the docs that just like swore. They couldn't believe what they saw, because what they saw, and I wish I had the picture. I actually have it on our X post if you look it up. Basically, the disease was all but gone on the right side. Everything I've told you before this story, I knew and I'd seen the stories. But when you just said to me that there are things that we have no idea what the benefits of sunlight could be in a lot of these things, because we haven't figured it out, I immediately thought about that story that I just told you about. Because who would have ever have thought that sunlight or this Firefly device that's basically giving off the same kind of light would be that beneficial in that type of a situation? Now, realize that this boy had been in the hospital at that point before he went outside for 6 weeks. How many patients do we put in nursing homes and never allow them to see the light of day? How many people are in hospitals for weeks on end and never get outside into the fresh air and the sunlight? And I at this point, what you're telling me, the things that you're saying to me, the things that I'm realizing that other people are showing, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that we could take advantage of if we would just get our patients outside.
I totally agree. Now, I want to tell people about a resource that they may not know about, and then I want to ask you a final wrap-up question. This guy has a YouTube channel called MedCram, and I have watched hundreds of his videos. And for the first few years I was watching MedCram videos, I had no idea who this guy was. I literally did not know him as a human being until I found him on Twitter and we started following each other. But if you are in med school residency, if you're a practicing physician, if you're an MD, DO, PhD, if you're a nurse, physical therapist, pharmacist, if you want to understand, I mean, how many videos do you have now? It's got to be thousands.
I don't know about thousands, but maybe a few hundred, maybe 400 or 500. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you've got questions about a subject, you need to review a subject. If you're sitting for step 1, 2, or 3 of the boards, you need phdhealth.com in your life, because I think you have a website too, but I only ever watch the YouTube videos. But man, that is such a resource for all things medical.
Well, thank you very much. We do offer CME credit for those that need it. So if they sometimes professionals are given money by their employers to go get continuing education. So we do offer that too.
Oh, that's excellent. Okay. Now, every video I make on my YouTube channel, I make it for just regular folks. Okay. So I want you to talk to just a regular person. They got a spouse, they got a job, they got a dog, they got a kid. They're just living their life. Give them just key principles, easy steps and tricks that they can do using sunlight to improve their health. And I agree with you. I think it'll improve your longevity, because basically longevity, if you delay the beginning or the progression of chronic disease, that must by definition lead to longevity. Right. Yep, and absolutely. So what's the regular guy, the regular woman? What would you say? Do the following things. This is going to make you healthier and it's going to push off that chronic disease.
If you could possibly get outside in the morning time, especially, but if you can at any time of day for just 20 to 30 minutes and feel that warmth of the sun, even if it's through clothes. So if you're concerned about getting skin damage, wear a broad rimmed hat. If you're concerned about your skin burning, wear a couple of layers of clothing. But if you get outside that sun will penetrate and will go through your clothes and give you the benefits that you need 20 to 30 minutes more than you're already doing. That's number one. Number two is, and this is not going to be easy, but I think you'll find a benefit, is if you could really reduce the amount of light that your eyes are exposed to after 9 o'clock. Getting to bed early, really, those hours of sleep before midnight are twice as important as those hours of light after midnight. So if you would do that, you would find that you would sleep better, you would sleep more deeply. And I'm a board certified sleep specialist, and I'm telling you this. You would sleep better, you would sleep longer, you would sleep more fully, and you would feel more rested. And dare I say that if your circadian rhythm is on track by doing that, you would also lose weight in the process.
I love that. And I've got step one handled. Step two, I'm still working on. I want to stay up past 9 p.m. So get out in the sunlight. And the infrared's going to penetrate those clothes. You're still going to be getting the benefit of that. Even if it's in the dead of winter, go outside 100%. If you have an elderly mother, dad, grandfather, grandmother, one of the best interventions I think that you can do for them is feed them a good, healthy diet and take them out into the sunlight each and every day for 20, 30 minutes. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
I love that.
I just saw a story, actually. Someone sent it to me because I collect these things, of a nursing home director who made a point during COVID to get his patients outside, not just giving them supplement of vitamin D, but to get them outside. And he said that, yes, one or two of them did have COVID, but he had to send none of his patients to the hospital.
I actually interviewed him on this channel. His name's Hal Kramer, and he owns 5 or 6 assisted living. And, right in the middle of the COVID thing, he was taking these folks outside for 20, 30, 40 minutes a day. Yeah. And he said that I think he had 2 of his residents test positive for COVID, but nobody was on a vent. Nobody passed away. And these are people in assisted living. So that they have multiple medical conditions. Yeah. But he had 0 losses in his assisted living patients during the heat, the heaviest part of the COVID. I actually interviewed him and we talked about that. So
maybe I saw it on your channel. That's where I heard it.
Maybe. So thank you so much, Doctor, for coming on and talking about this. I think this is one of the most important things that is not being talked about in the average doctor-patient interaction. I don't think this message is getting out there like it should. So I really appreciate the work you're doing on social media to try to get this out there. And I'm going to keep trying to magnify it as well.
We'll work together.
Tell people. Yeah, absolutely. Tell people where they can find you if they want to dig deeper into the way you think, because I love the way you think about stuff.
Well, thanks. Yeah. So MedCram videos. So that's on YouTube. If you just type in MedCram, you'll come to our channel. We're also, if you're interested in seeing some of our courses where we actually talk about regular everyday medical issues like congestive heart failure, COPD, asthma, that's at medcram.com. That's medcram.com. And then you can come and see us on X, both Dr. Barry and myself. You just type in my name, Roger Schwelt. You'll find me on X as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Doctor. This has been fascinating. I hope everybody pays careful attention to this and shares it with somebody who has some chronic medical conditions, because they have a sunlight deficiency. I can almost guarantee it.
Exactly.
Thank you, Doctor. See you next time. Bye-bye.